Silent Hill 2 is the first entry in the franchise I've actually played. Going in, my expectations from nearly 2 decades of only passing references were for a game that was heavy on atmosphere and psychological elements, along with Resident Evil-style survival horror gameplay. While it definitely delivered on these expectations for the most part, I never expected it to be as deep as it was, sometimes literally. So much so that when I was finished, I felt I needed some time to organize my thoughts, rather than just summarizing them at the end of the final episode like I usually do. Now that I've had a few days to think about it, here's why I loved Silent Hill 2. The game starts off by telling you your motivation. Find your wife, who has written you a letter telling you to come meet her in this town. Only problem, she's been dead for 3 years. From the word go, James has a mission which he's determined to accomplish, yet he knows doesn't make any sense. It's a delusional quest that couldn't possibly be taken at face value, but which can't be ignored. For the sake of his sanity, he must take on an insane task. This should have been my first clue that Silent Hill 2 operates on dream logic. Much of it doesn't even make sense on a literal level, and it usually doesn't communicate important points with words or even events. As I progressed, I found that whenever the game wanted me to think or feel something, I would always just kind of get it. See, each section of the game is accompanied by a different mood, which I eventually came to realize was shifting me into different thoughts and expectations, often independent of anything actually happening. The walk into town is marked by a sense of mystery and foreboding, as both James and the player have no idea of what to expect at this point. After you encounter your first monster, and the streets become filled with them, you run around town in a panic, now knowing you can't really fight and trying to find a way to progress with very little direction, not giving you a clear objective to directly run to. The apartments suddenly shift the game into more dark and claustrophobic territory, where you'll no longer be able to rely on running and dodging. At this point, James is likely starting to wonder what he's gotten himself into, and for what seems like such a foolish reason. And what better time to introduce Pyramid Head, the unkillable juggernaut, first encountered staring silently at you through some bars, then trapping you with him in a cramped room as he slowly lumbers after you, with nowhere to go and barely enough room to dodge around him for what seems like forever. You then make your way to the park, where James initially expects to find Mary, and instead meets Maria, who looks extremely similar to Mary and is almost James' ideal version of her. She decides to join James, and at this moment, his mood likely improves significantly. He now has some company that seems much more lucid than the other people he's met so far. He's back outside where enemies are less of a threat, and, I suspect at least, he's thinking that even if he doesn't find Mary, at this point, it's almost like he has. And I may be stretching here, but maybe he even feels like he's found something better? This trend continues when you enter the bowling alley and encounter Laura chatting with / bullying Eddie over pizza, while catchy music plays, possibly over the building's own speakers. At this moment, it starts to feel like things maybe aren't so bad. You're with other fairly normal people now, in a surprisingly comfy place. Now all you have to do is go wrangle Laura, who has run off again and may know something about Mary. Maria accompanies James to the hospital in search of Laura, and this is where the mental descent starts to take shape. You're once more stuck in dark, narrow hallways, now with more dangerous enemies and in greater numbers. The darkness here feels somehow thicker, and upon reaching the roof, you'll find that night has fallen. Maria begins to feel sick and has to lie down, forcing James to continue on his own, and no doubt bringing back memories of Mary and her condition. If the player tries talking to her again, she'll ask James.
James, I want to ask you something. What if you can't find Mary? What will you do?
You move forward, with those words in your head, the soundtrack now an ominous droning, and this is when I started to doubt the possibility of any happy conclusion, or that such a thing was ever possible in the first place. And at this point, I think James does as well. As you exit the hospital, Maria is killed by Pyramid Head, leaving James completely alone once again. He asks himself, "Are you really waiting somewhere for me? Or is this your way of taking?" One of the earliest signs that there's something about their relationship that James hasn't told us. The town is now blanketed in the darkness of night, and no less hostile. The only direction comes when James finds a note with instructions on how to enter the Historical Society, and begging him not to. You make your way up the road to the Historical Society, and once inside, you get a brief moment to gather yourself. Your radio is no longer blaring static, and even the soundtrack has gone silent. The rooms contain photographs and artwork showcasing the town's history, which all seem fairly normal. All except for one. You'll then notice a large hole in the wall, and within, a staircase. It goes down an impossibly long way, the silence broken only by your own footsteps and the occasional blaring of a foghorn. Eventually, you finally reach the bottom, pass through the doorway, and against all logic, end up in a prison. Upon finding a trap door, without so much as a hint of doubt or hesitation, James chooses to jump blindly down into the dark. He finds several more of these deep black holes, each time jumping down without a thought, going deeper and deeper with increasing frequency as the prison becomes more and more twisted and everything seems to make less and less sense. For the first time, James does not have the option of turning back anymore, and can only continue his descent in the irrational assumption that at the end of it all awaits some kind of worthwhile conclusion. During all of this, he runs into Mary, who dies yet again after a very confusing conversation. Finally, he meets Eddie again, who has clearly gone off the deep end and forces James to kill him in self-defense. James is distraught by this, but upon opening the next doorway, somehow, he finds himself back at the boat launch behind the Historical Society. It's daytime again, and the weight that's been building ever since the hospital feels like it's suddenly been lifted, like somehow a breakthrough has been made, and he begins to row across the lake to the hotel, continuing his pursuit of Mary. The third floor, where Mary is supposedly waiting for him, is locked, but her voice can be briefly, barely heard. Okay, I guess it's... You hear that? Between this, the lifting of night, and the lack of enemies, it starts to feel like the end is in sight, like the nightmare is almost over. But of course, when you finally arrive in the room, the truth is revealed. It's only when this understanding is reached, though, that James is able to begin to return to reality. So, why have I just summarized the entire game in this way when I'm meant to be explaining why I liked it? Because I can't talk about what makes Silent Hill 2 great without describing how most of its story is told only with the changing of its vibe, with very few actual events taking place at all. A lot of the time, it almost seems like the mood is what influences events, rather than the other way around, like the world itself is responding to James' mental state, which apparently it is. There had already been hints throughout the game that other characters aren't seeing the same things you are, and we do catch glimpses of what Silent Hill looks like to them. It's explicitly stated right before the penultimate boss fight that Pyramid Head represents James' desire to be punished for what he did to Mary, but it's not the town punishing him for murder. It's James punishing himself for how he felt about it. When you consider that Angela is nothing but a victim, it becomes clear that these characters aren't being given the experience they deserve, but the one they feel they deserve. James killed Mary mainly out of compassion, but because he spent those 3 years trying to be there for her, essentially tied to her side while enduring the abuse she hurls at him out of frustration and anger at her condition, there was a part of him that was just glad to be done with the whole thing. It doesn't help that she sent some serious mixed messages, making it very unclear what she actually wanted. It's gotta be one of the most complex situations ever depicted in a video game story. While I do believe that mercy was his primary motivation, the manifestations of Silent Hill are all symbolic of his guilt at having had more selfish feelings at all, which is why Maria is at the center of one of the earliest and better implemented moral systems in gaming, in that it doesn't even tell you it's keeping score, and doesn't judge on a binary scale. Rather, it gauges whether James is able to forgive himself, mainly based on the player's interactions with Maria. Staying close to her, checking in with her at the hospital, and protecting her from enemies will actually lead to one of the more cynical endings, with James considering her a direct replacement for Mary. The Leave ending, which has James leaving town with Laura to begin finally living his life again, requires that the player treat Maria as just being along for the ride, staying focused on finding Mary above all else. In other words, leaving means processing what happened and moving forward, while staying with Maria means remaining stagnant, learning nothing, and being doomed to repeat the same mistakes. I think the reason James is able to leave the prison after killing Eddie is because, despite being upset about it, it still serves as the first part of his self-forgiveness. Unlike Maria, he's a real person, seemingly on the wrong path of his own journey. But as for his purpose in the story, I think he represents James' own anger and capacity for violence. When James kills him, maybe he's symbolically killing that part of himself? Which would be odd, considering he just now killed an actual living person. Or maybe he just accepts it as a necessity, allowing him to consider that maybe killing Mary wasn't a selfish act. Or maybe indulging in violence just feels more honest to him now, allowing him to break out of his repetitive, toxic thought patterns symbolized by the endless descent of the prison. To be honest, I'm still not entirely sure why killing Eddie allows James to end this cycle and leave the prison. But if we're going with the idea that the town reflects where his head is at, it's curious that he's brought out of the darkest part of the game by killing someone. In the end, I didn't find Silent Hill 2 scary in the sense that I thought I would. See, I was expecting a traditional survival horror game that just handles atmosphere better than most. But that wasn't the case at all. There was only one chase, and I could count the number of jump scares on one hand. Though what jump scares they were. Oh my god! Oh. Oh, my heart. Though the term gets misapplied a lot these days, it really is psychological horror. It leaves you feeling this constant hostility, which is different from danger. As I previously explained, everything about everything is constructed to personally torment James. With the exception of Pyramid Head, you don't even feel any sense of malevolence or even intelligence coming from the enemies themselves. They're more like a part of the environment than anything, which means you still feel alone even as you're being attacked. They're not particularly dangerous most of the time, just dangerous enough to keep you constantly on guard. In your interactions with the characters, you're often meant to be confused, such as conflicting evidence about when Mary actually died, Maria repeatedly dying and coming back as if nothing happened, and the slightly off behavior of the other characters. Silent Hill 2, ultimately, is a game that speaks in beats rather than words, perhaps knowing that the best way to portray a nightmare is to speak the language of nightmares.